Hi class, in this recording we're going to dive in and start talking about the autonomic nervous system. So let's dive into it. As we look at our autonomic nervous systems, there are a couple things that we need to emphasize. First of all, with our ANS, so in this context, if you hear the abbreviation ANS, think autonomic nervous system. Our autonomic nervous system, well, is controlled automatically. We don't consciously think about controlling it. So glandular secretions, cardiomyocytes, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle tissue, all of these things will be controlled automatically. Particularly the smooth muscle tissue is going to comprise a lot of our organs and also the glandular secretions as well. So because we're referring to organs, it can be thought of as the organ motor system or visceral motor system. Now, when we look at the organs of the autonomic nervous system, the viscera or organs of the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. I know it says abdominal, but really abdominal pelvic cavities. Also, we have some structures that are spread throughout the body. For instance, our cutaneous blood vessels, so the blood vessels near the skin of our body, or near the surface of our body, sweat glands, and piloerector glands. So in other words, if you activate the autonomic nervous system correctly, just the right stimuli, and we're not talking about temperature, but you could start sweating or get goosebumps in response to emotional or psychological stimuli, in addition to the physical stimuli that we're so used to. As we look at the autonomic nervous system, and again, I emphasized in the last slide, but it's involuntary. We don't control whether it happens. The visceral effectors, the organs that are going to be affected by the autonomic nervous system, don't depend on the ANS to function. Do not depend on the ANS to function. The ANS just tweaks their functioning, tweaks it so that the organism as a whole, can function more effectively. A good analogy would be that, when you bake bread, if you do a good job, you get a nice big fluffy loaf of bread if you tweak things just right. But whether or not you do a good job, if you throw, some eggs, some flour and water in the oven and bake it, you're gonna get something that you can eat. It may not be very good, it may not be very functional, but you'll get something. Um, when we look at denervation hypersensitivity, denervation is a term that refers to the loss of nervous system control. Hypersensitivity refers to the fact that we're going to get a disproportionately large response or large signal relative to the stimulus that's generating the signal. So when we think of denervation hypersensitivity, which is related to the autonomic nervous system, we have exaggerated responses of cardiac and smooth muscles if autonomic nerves are severed. So these autonomic nerves help to control and modulate some of the responses of other organs in our body. A good example of what the autonomic nervous system controls is our reflexes. And when we think of the visceral reflexes, these are organ-based reflexes. So they're unconscious, they're automatic, and they're going to involve responses and effectors and receptors. A classic visceral response is the baroflex. And the root word associated with this is baro, which refers to pressure. Think of a barometer, which measures air pressure. And when we think of the baroreflex, this is going to involve baroreceptors in our blood vessels and in our brain measuring blood pressure. That signal is then sent to our brain. The signal is processed automatically. And then we are then going to send a signal back to the heart to adjust blood pressure. So for example, if we have increased blood pressure, if our blood pressure is getting too high, our body measures that, processes that information, and then we're going to use the vagus nerve to send an inhibitory signal to the heart. And that inhibitory signal lowers the heart rate decreases, and then blood pressure will go down a little bit. As we look at a reflex arc, these generic parts of a reflex arc are going to involve a receptor that receives the signal, an afferent neuron carries the signal to the central nervous system. And then within the central nervous system, we have our interneuron, or integrating center, where the signal is processed. Efferent neurons are going to carry the signal away from the CNS, and that efferent neuron will carry the signal to an effector. Usually the effector is some kind of muscle or gland. So as we think of the autonomic nervous system, because it's um, automatically controlling these organs of the body, these visceral organs of the body, we consider an efferent pathway because it is exiting from the central nervous system. Now, as we look at the autonomic nervous system, there are two main branches of the autonomic nervous system. We have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And when we think of the sympathetic nervous system, this is a branch of the autonomic nervous system that gets us ready for, and really in a nutshell, fight or flight, or as some of the newer textbooks are saying, fight or flight or freeze. So what happens with the sympathetic branch? We get ready for lots of physical activity, physical exertion. So we're going to have increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased airflow through the lungs. We're going to modulate our blood glucose levels, and then we're going to take blood and redirect that blood um, from the skin and digestive tracts. Because really, if you are in a high stress situation, you don't need a lot of blood going to your face. You don't need a lot of blood going to your intestines. You need as much blood as possible going to your heart, your lungs, your skeletal muscles, and your brains. So this is going to be the high stress branch of the autonomic nervous system, how we deal with stress, S-T-R-E-S-S, stress. Now, when we look at the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, this is referred to as the rest and digest branch of the nervous system. And this resting and digesting branch of the nervous system is going to focus on repair, regeneration, maintenance for our body. It calms a lot of the functions or symptoms of the sympathetic division so that we can focus on maintenance. So when we have the parasympathetic division activated, this is when we feel sleepy. This is when we focus on digesting food. Like if we think of food coma, food comas are initiated by the parasympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system. Another thing that's initiated by this parasympathetic division is that a lot of us have to have a bowel movement or defecate or go number two on the toilet after we eat a large meal because of activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, as we look at autonomic tone, this is going to be normal background activity that is kind of a teeter-totter or a tug of war between the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. So when we think of that parasympathetic tone, it's going to maintain smooth muscle, tension in the intestines, and it keeps our resting heart rate down to typically no higher than 70 or 80 beats per minute. So it allows us to actually rest and actually digest the food that we have. Now, if we think of the sympathetic tone, our sympathetic tone is going to keep our blood vessels partially constricted. So we're going to have mild vasoconstriction, and that mild constriction will give us a minimum blood pressure. So as we look at these two branches of the ANS, or this autonomic tone, we can see a parasympathetic and a sympathetic branch working together in the background to help keep us ready for action and ready to rest. As we look at the sympathetic division as a whole, our sympathetic division can excite the heart and inhibit digestive and urinary functions. And if we look at the parasympathetic, I'm going to switch colors here. The parasympathetic branch is going to have the opposite effect. And that's a key word. I'm going to draw some arrows to that because you know what, really when we think about this parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, I want you to think opposite of the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. So as we're looking at this figure here on the screen, we can see a pathway. Particularly, we are going to have a somatic pathway. And as we look at the somatic pathway, this is going to be a voluntary. So think of this as a typical pathway to a voluntary skeletal muscle. We'll have a motor neuron in the anterior horn of gray matter within the spinal column. And that motor neuron is going to have an axon traveling all the way to the target muscle in this, or effector organ, in this case, a skeletal muscle, and it's one long axon. So we really need to emphasize that we have a long axon, a long myelinated axon. Now, in the autonomic pathway, we are going to have some ganglia involved. For instance, with the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to have that that neuron in the spinal column, and it's going to exit the CNS, go to the PNS, and then synapse with an autonomic ganglion for a sympathetic pathway. Oh, let me clear the screen here. There we go. So we have a shorter axon, and then we have a synapse occurring at an autonomic ganglion, and then that from the ganglion, we're going to have another axon carry the signal all the way to the heart. This ganglion, this step right here, this extra ganglion, means that we have one more level of processing and control and modulation of the signal for the autonomic nervous system. And as we look at the neurons, the neuron that comes before the ganglion is referred to as the presynaptic neuron, and then the neuron that comes after the ganglion is the postsynaptic neuron. And that's for a sympathetic division. Now, as we look at a parasympathetic division at the bottom of the screen here, this parasympathetic division is going to have a similar setup. We have the presynaptic neuron, which is much longer, and the postsynaptic neuron is much shorter, but there's still going to be that ganglion present, that synapsing occurring within the ganglion. That's all we have for this recording. Guys, gals, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board or shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.